The popular image of the Wild West portrayed in books, television, and film has been one of violence and mayhem. The lure of quick riches through mining or driving cattle meant that much of the West did indeed consist of rough men living a rough life. Although the violence was exaggerated and even glorified in the dime store novels of the day. When people think about the 19th century American West, they see a violent, lawless place filled with shootouts, guns, and robbery. Moreover, the exploits of Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and others made for good stories. But the reality was that Western violence was more isolated than the stories might suggest. In today's video, we will investigate whether the West really was a violent and uncontrolled place, as depicted in pop culture. To investigate this myth, we would look at areas of crime and violence, murder rates, types of crimes committed, types of law enforcement, and things related to the rise in crime rates. Stay tuned as we show you the culture of violence in the American West. The West is popularly seen as a vast open area void of people, and this was true at the beginning of Western expansion. However, as the West moved into the 19th century, a large population started to take hold. To begin to look at the lawlessness, the best place to begin would be the wagon trains that brought people out into the West. These trains brought people, many of whom had never gone more than a few miles from where they grew up, were now thrust into a great empty place, void of the laws and rules they once knew. As would be expected, this led to some people taking advantage of this lack of laws and running wild. Fearing this, the leaders within the trains, along with other members, created laws to govern their trip through the country. Just as traveling on the open ocean, the plains were a vast sea of grass. The laws were created to reflect that. Like their fellow travelers on the ocean, the pioneers and their prairie schooners negotiated a plains law, much like their counterpart sea law. The result of this negotiation, in many cases, was the adoption of a formal constitution. With these constitutions, a tree of leaders was created to determine who would enforce any laws or rule. Examples of these roles would be captain, assistant, captain, treasurer, secretary, and an officer of the guard. The members of the train voted on rules and different legislation. If laws were broken, there was a chance of being removed from the train and forced to carry on alone, which would most likely result in death or being forced to return home. Not all places in the West were so well run or organized, and certain places really took the term Wild West to heart. Some places in the West were quite rough and violent. Mining towns and settlements were one example of this. This was in part due to the type of person that chose to live in a place such as this. These people embodied the American spirit to search for wealth, but were also usually handicapped in terms of strong morality, being driven by their search for gold. These miners were usually armed and carried little moral guidance. This led to violence being a common occurrence, but these areas had little to no influence from the United States government. These areas had to create their court systems, often biased and flawed. In some cases, a man, no matter what the crime, would never be convicted. It was also common for some cases to never go to court, as the community generally relied on habits of thought instead of common laws. Under these habits, things normally that would have drawn a large reaction and use of the police, such as in the East, were accepted in these areas. An example of this is calling a man a liar, a thief, or a son of a bitch. Is provocation sufficient to justify instant slaying? Clearly, people within these mining towns were held to a slightly different standard than other places in the West, meaning that even with these limited rules, these areas were much more violent than other areas, such as a more established town or trading post out west. These other areas tried to be as peaceful as possible, as violence would turn business away and leave nothing to support the town. These cattle towns were quick to establish small police forces to control travelers. People were mostly arrested for small misdemeanors, such as disturbing the peace, fighting, or being drunk in public. There were few arrests or convictions for more serious crimes. For instance, in the town of Wichita, the recorded crime rates for the 12 months following March 1st, 1874, were slightly high for offenses but low in serious crimes. For a year, the town was relatively peaceful, as almost all of these crimes were misdemeanors, usually meaning small incidents, such as carrying a weapon in town or disturbing the peace. While this was a somewhat small town, which made this number of crimes seem high, the number of people that passed through the town multiple times a year must be taken into account. This makes the number of crimes seem more reasonable. Ranching brought with it its dangers and violence. In the Texas cattle lands, owners of large ranches took advantage of their wealth and the new invention of barbed wire to claim the prime grazing lands and few significant watering holes for their herds. Those seeking only to move their few herds of cattle to market grew increasingly frustrated at their inability to find even a blade of grass for their meager herds. Eventually, frustration turned to violence as several ranchers resorted to vandalizing the barbed wire fences to gain access to grass and water for their steers. Such vandalism quickly led to cattle rustling, as these cowboys were not opposed to leading a few of the ranchers' steers into their herds as they left. One example of the violence that bubbled up was the infamous fence-cutting war in Clay County, Texas. There, cowboys began destroying fences that several ranchers erected along public lands, land they had no right to enclose. Confrontations between the cowboys and armed guards hired by the ranchers resulted in 3 deaths. Hardly a war, but enough of a problem to get the governor's attention. Eventually, a special session of the Texas legislature addressed the problem by passing laws to outlaw fence cutting, forcing ranchers to remove fences illegally erected along public lands, and placing gates for passage where public areas adjoin private lands. An even more violent confrontation occurred between large ranchers and small farmers in Johnson County, Wyoming, where cattle ranchers organized a lynching bee in 1891 and 1892 to make examples of cattle rustlers, hiring 22 invaders from Texas to serve as hired guns. The ranch owners and their foremen hunted and subsequently killed the 2 leaders best known for organizing the owners of the smaller Wyoming farms. Only the intervention of federal troops, who arrested and then later released the invaders, allowing them to return to Texas, prevented a greater tragedy. While there is much talk, both real and mythical, about the rough men who lived this life, relatively few women experienced it. While homesteaders were often families, gold speculators and cowboys tended to be single men in pursuit of fortune. The few women who went to these wild outposts were typically prostitutes, and even their numbers were limited. In 1860, in the Comstock Lode region of Nevada, for example, there were reportedly only 30 women total in a town of 2,500 men. Some of the painted ladies who began as prostitutes eventually owned brothels and emerged as businesswomen in their own right. However, life for these young women remained challenging as Western settlement progressed. A handful of women, numbering no more than 600, braved the elements and male-dominated culture to become teachers in several of the more established cities in the West. Even fewer arrived to support husbands or operate stores in these mining towns. As wealthy men brought their families west, the lawless landscape began to change slowly. Abilene, Kansas, is one example of a lawless town, replete with prostitutes, gambling, and other vices, transformed when middle-class women arrived in the 1880s with their cattle-baron husbands. These women began to organize churches, schools, civic clubs, and other community programs to promote family values. They fought to remove opportunities for prostitution and all the other vices that they felt threatened the values that they held dear. Protestant missionaries eventually joined the women in their efforts, and while they were not widely successful, they did bring greater attention to the problems. As a response, the U.S. Congress passed both the Comstock Law in 1873 to ban the spread of lewd and lascivious literature through the mail, and the subsequent Page Act of 1875 to prohibit the transportation of women into the United States for employment as prostitutes. However, the houses of ill repute continued to operate and remain popular throughout the West, despite the efforts of reformers. The real culture of violence in the American West of the latter half of the 19th century sprang from the U.S. government's policies toward the Plains Indians. It is untrue that white European settlers were always at war with Indians, as popular folklore contends. After all, Indians assisted the Pilgrims and celebrated the first Thanksgiving with them. John Smith married Pocahontas, a white man, mostly Scots with some Cherokee. John Ross was the chief of the Cherokees of Tennessee and North Carolina, and there was always a great deal of trade with Indians, as opposed to violence. As Jennifer Roback has written, Europeans generally acknowledged that the Indians retained possessory rights to their lands. More importantly, the English recognized the advantage of being on friendly terms with the Indians. Trade with the Indians, especially the fur trade, was profitable. War was costly. Trade and cooperation with the Indians were much more common than conflict and violence during the first half of the 19th century. Terry Anderson and Fred McKesney relate how Thomas Jefferson found that during his time. Negotiation was the Europeans' predominant means of acquiring land from Indians. By the 20th century, some 800 million lands had been paid for Indian lands. These authors also argue that various factors can alter the incentives for trade, as opposed to waging a war of conquest, as a means of acquiring land. One of the most important factors is the existence of a standing army, as opposed to militias, which were used in the American West prior to the war between the states. On this point, Anderson and McKesney quote Adam Smith, who wrote that, in a militia, the character of the laborer, artificer, or tradesman predominates over that of the soldier. In a standing army, that of the soldier predominates over every other character. A standing army, according to Anderson and McKesney, creates a class of professional soldiers whose personal welfare increases with warfare, even if fighting is a negative-sum act for the population as a whole. The change from militia to a standing army took place in the American West immediately upon the conclusion of the war between the states. The result, say Anderson and McKesney, was that white settlers and railroad corporations were able to socialize the costs of stealing Indian lands by using violence supplied by the U.S. Army. On their own, they were much more likely to negotiate peacefully. Thus, raid replaced trade in white Indian relations. Congress even voted in 1871 not to ratify any more Indian treaties, effectively announcing that it no longer sought peaceful relations with the Plains Indians. On June 27, 1865, General William Tecumseh Sherman was given command of the military district of the Missouri, which was one of the 5 military divisions into which the U.S. government had divided the country. Sherman received this command for the purpose of commencing the 25-year war against the Plains Indians, primarily as a form of veiled subsidy to the government-subsidized railroad corporations and other politically connected corporations involved in building the transcontinental railroads. These corporations were the financial backbone of the Republican Party. Indeed, in June 1861, Abraham Lincoln, former legal counsel of the Illinois Central Railroad, called a special emergency session of Congress, not to deal with the 2-month-old Civil War, but to commence work on the Pacific Railway Act. Subsidizing the transcontinental railroads was a primary objective of the new Republican Party. The federal railroad subsidies enriched many Republican members of Congress. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania received a block of Union Pacific stock in exchange for his vote on the Pacific Railroad Bill. The Pennsylvania iron manufacturer and congressman also demanded a legal requirement that all iron used in constructing the railroad be made in the United States. The chief engineer of the government-subsidized transcontinental railroads was Grenville Dodge, another of Lincoln's generals, during the war with whom Sherman worked closely after. Dodge helped swing the Iowa delegation to Lincoln at the 1860 Republican National Convention. And in return, early in the Civil War, Lincoln appointed Dodge to Army General. Dodge's task was to clear the Indians from the designated path of the country's first heavily subsidized, federally chartered transcontinental railroad, the Union Pacific. Immediately after the war, Dodge proposed enslaving the Plains Indians and forcing them to do the grading on the railroad beds, with the Army furnishing a guard to make the Indians work and keep them from running away. Union Army veterans were to be the overseers of this new class of slaves. Dodge's proposal was rejected. The U.S. government decided instead to try to kill as many Indians as possible. What Sherman called a final solution to the Indian problem involved killing hostile Indians and segregating their pauperized survivors in remote places. Sherman's overall policy was never accommodation and compromise, but vigorous war against the Indians, whom he regarded as a less than human and savage race. One of the most famous incidents of Indian extermination, known as the Sand Creek Massacre, took place on November 29, 1864. There was a Cheyenne and Arapaho village located on Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado. These Indians had been assured by the U.S. government that they would be safe in Colorado. The government instructed them to fly a U.S. flag over their village, which they did to assure their safety. However, another Civil War luminary, Colonel John Chivington, had other plans for them, as he raided the village with 750 heavily armed soldiers. Chivington's orders were, "I want you to kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice." Then, despite the display of the U.S. flag and white surrender flags by these peaceful Indians, Chivington's troops began a full day given over to bloodlust, orgiastic mutilation, rapine, and destruction, with Chivington looking on and approving. Upon returning to his fort, Chivington and his raiders demonstrated around Denver, waving their trophies and drying scalps of more than 100. They were acclaimed as conquering heroes, which was what they had sought mainly. In conclusion, the culture of violence in the American West of the late 19th century was created almost entirely by the U.S. government's military interventions, which were primarily a veiled subsidy to the government-subsidized transcontinental railroad corporations. As scandals go, the war on the Plains Indians makes the Credit Mobilier affair seem inconsequential. The U.S. government killed tens of thousands of Indians, including women and children, during the years from 1862 to 1890. There are various estimates of the number of Indians killed, the highest being that of historian Russell Thornton, who used mostly military records to estimate that about 45,000 Indians, including women and children, were killed during the wars on the Plains Indians. It is reasonable to assume that thousands more were maimed and disabled for life, and received little or no medical assistance. The thousands of soldiers who participated in the Indian Wars lived in a culture of violence and death that was cultivated by the U.S. government for a quarter of a century. There is such a thing as a culture of war, especially in connection with a war as gruesome and bloody as the war on the Plains Indians. It was not necessary to kill tens of thousands of Indians and imprison thousands more in concentration camps, reservations, for generations in order to build a transcontinental railroad. Nor were the wars on the Plains Indians a matter of the white populations waging a war of extermination. This war stemmed from the policy of the relatively small group of white men who ran the Republican Party with assistance from some Democrats, which effectively monopolized national politics for most of that time. It's on that note we end today's episode. Thank you for joining us once again. We hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you will be the first to see our new updates.